Nobody should die alone on a frozen street, forgotten by the world. But that's exactly where 71-year-old Raymond finds himself on this bitter Cleveland night, his failing heart struggling with each breath. He was once a faithful man who swept the floors of St. Michael's Cathedral, but life had stripped away everything. Now the cancer in his lungs ensures this cold pavement will be his deathbed. As the icy wind pierces through his rugged blanket, Raymond closes his eyes and waits for the end. Then a gentle voice calls his name. When he looks up, she's there, the Virgin Mary in her flowing blue robe, just like from his childhood church. She kneels beside him and speaks words that will change everything. But why would heaven send its most sacred mother to a broken, homeless man who lost his faith? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Raymond's trembling fingers found the worn prayer card tucked deep in his coat pocket, a faded image of the Virgin Mary that he'd carried for decades, even through the darkest valleys of his life. The edges were soft from handling, the colors bleached by time and weather, but her face remained serene, unchanged. He'd pulled it out countless times over the years, sometimes in faith, sometimes in desperation, and now, perhaps for the last time, in wonder. The street lamp above cast harsh shadows across the cracked sidewalk where he lay, but her presence seemed to soften even those hard edges. The blue of her robe was deeper than any earthly fabric, luminous in a way that made the fluorescent glare seem pale and distant. When she spoke, her voice carried the warmth of summer afternoons and the comfort of a mother's lullaby. "Raymond," she said again, and hearing his name spoken with such tenderness nearly broke what remained of his weathered heart. "I have come to walk with you." He tried to sit up, his body protesting every movement, but she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The touch was real, warm, substantial, not the fevered imagination of a dying mind. Through the thin fabric of his coat, he could feel the peace that radiated from her, a balm for pain that had nothing to do with the cancer eating away at his lungs. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of traffic on Superior Avenue. "I stopped believing, stopped deserving." "Hush now," she said, settling beside him on the cold concrete as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Tell me about the cathedral." The cathedral. How long had it been since he'd allowed himself to think about St. Michael's without the crushing weight of shame? 37 years he'd worked those halls, from the time he was a young man with calloused hands and an eager heart until everything fell apart. "I loved that place," he said, surprising himself with the admission. "Every morning at 5:30 I'd unlock the heavy oak doors and step into the silence. The way the morning light would filter through those stained glass windows, St. Peter, St. Paul, and you, always you in the center with your arms outstretched. I'd sweep the nave first, then polish each pew until it gleamed. Father Martinez used to say I treated that church like it was my own home." The memory brought a ghost of a smile to his weathered face. Father Martinez, a small man with kind eyes and hands that smelled perpetually of incense. He'd been more than a boss. He'd been the closest thing to a father Raymond had known since his own dad died when Raymond was 12. "The old priest understood the weight of caring for God's house," she said, and somehow Raymond knew she had watched him during those years, had seen the reverence with which he'd approached each task. "You were faithful in the small things." "I was," he said, and for the first time in decades he spoke without self-recrimination. "I took pride in that work, real pride, not the foolish kind. When families came for Sunday Mass, when young couples stood at the altar for their weddings, when parents brought their babies for baptism, I knew I'd helped create a space worthy of those moments. The floors would shine, the brass would gleam, every corner would be clean and welcoming." He remembered Thomas coming to visit him at work sometimes, his younger brother impressed by the grandeur of the cathedral and Raymond's role in maintaining it. Thomas had been 20 then, fresh out of college and full of big dreams about becoming a lawyer. He'd tease Raymond about being a glorified janitor, but there'd been respect in his voice, admiration for his older brother who'd found his calling in service. "And your family?" she asked gently, though Raymond sensed she already knew the answer. The peace she'd brought began to fracture around the edges. "My family," he repeated, the words tasting of ashes. "Thomas was going to change the world, you know. Defend the innocent, fight for justice. He was so bright, so determined. And Michael," Raymond's voice caught. "Michael was just 7 when I left. 7 years old with his mother's dark eyes and his grandfather's stubborn chin. He used to wait for me by the window every evening, watching for my truck to pull into the driveway. The cancer in his lungs seemed to tighten its grip, making each breath a conscious effort. But it wasn't the disease that made his chest ache now. It was the memory of little Michael's face the last time he'd seen it, streaked with tears and confusion as Raymond packed his few belongings into the back of his pickup truck. "I was supposed to be better than my father," he said. "I was supposed to stay." She waited, patient as eternity, while he gathered the strength to continue. The drinking started slow. A beer after work, then 2, then a bottle of whiskey hidden in my tool shed. Thomas was building his law practice, making something of himself, and there I was, 45 years old, still sweeping floors and emptying trash cans. It shouldn't have mattered. That work was honest. It was good. But somewhere along the way I started feeling small, insignificant. The night traffic had thinned, leaving them in a pocket of relative quiet. Steam rose from a manhole cover down the block, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle mourned its way across the industrial flats toward Lake Erie. "Father Martinez tried to help," Raymond continued. "He could smell the alcohol on my breath during morning prayer, see the tremor in my hands. He offered to arrange counseling, gave me books about addiction and faith, even offered to reduce my hours so I could attend meetings. But I was too proud, too ashamed. I told him I could handle it myself." Pride, that ancient enemy of souls. It had wrapped around his heart like ivy around a tree, slowly strangling the life out of everything he touched. He'd been proud of his work, proud of his family. And when those prides began to feel hollow, he'd become proud of his ability to hide his pain, proud of his capacity to endure, proud even of his martyrdom. "The morning I came to work drunk was the beginning of the end," he said. "I'd been celebrating, if you could call it that, Thomas passing the bar exam. Drank myself stupid and showed up at the Cathedral barely able to walk straight. During early mass, I knocked over a candle stand. Hot wax everywhere, nearly caught the altar cloth on fire. Father Martinez had to help me to his office while the congregation watched." Even now, 26 years later, the humiliation burned fresh. The disappointed faces of the parishioners, the whispered concerns, the way children stared as their parents hurried them past. He'd defiled something sacred, turned his sanctuary into a place of shame. "He didn't fire me that day," Raymond said. "Father Martinez was too kind for that. He suspended me for a week, told me to get help, to come back when I was ready to honor the commitment I'd made to God and the parish. But I never went back. Instead, he'd gone home and finished the bottle, then started another. When Sarah found him passed out in the kitchen that evening, little Michael crying in the next room because dinner wasn't ready and Daddy wouldn't. Wake up, she delivered her ultimatum, get help or get out. I chose to get out, he admitted. Told myself I was protecting them from my shame, but really I was just protecting myself from having to face what I'd become. The Virgin Mary's expression remained serene, but Raymond thought he detected a flicker of sadness in her eyes. Not disappointment, but sorrow for the pain that pride had inflicted, for the love that fear had poisoned. The years after that are mostly a blur, he said. Odd jobs when I could get them, sleeping in my truck, then shelters when I lost the truck, then the streets when I wore out my welcome at the shelters. I'd see Thomas's name in the newspaper. Sometimes big cases, civil rights work, everything he'd dreamed of doing. And Sarah remarried a good man, a contractor who could provide stability for Michael. I told myself they were better off without me. The prayer card in his fingers was growing damp from his tears. How many nights had he stared at that serene face, wondering if grace was real or just a beautiful lie people told themselves to make the darkness bearable. "The cancer came 3 months ago," he said. "Doctor at the free clinic told me it had spread too far for treatment. 6 months, maybe less." Part of me was relieved, tired of carrying this guilt, tired of wondering what my son looked like as a man, tired of watching my little brother's success from a distance like some kind of ghost. The wind had died down, and with it the bitter cold that had been seeping into his bones. Her presence created a warmth that seemed to emanate from within, as if his body remembered what it felt like to be cared for, to be worthy of love. "But here you are," she said simply. "But here you are," he repeated, wonder creeping back into his voice. "Why? I abandoned my calling, destroyed my family, wasted the gifts I was given. I'm nobody, nothing. You are my son," she said. And the words settled into the broken places of his heart like seeds in fertile soil. "You are loved beyond your ability to comprehend, forgiven beyond your ability to believe, and called to something greater than your ability to imagine." "It's too late," he whispered. "I'm dying." "Are you?" she asked, and her smile held mysteries deeper than the night sky. "Death is not what you think it is, Raymond, and neither is redemption." The Virgin Mary reached into the folds of her blue robe and withdrew something that made Raymond's breath catch in his throat. A photograph, creased and faded, but unmistakably familiar. It was the picture from his wallet, the one he'd carried, until the leather fell apart and he'd lost everything to the streets. Michael, at age 5, gap-toothed grin, bright as sunshine, sitting on Raymond's shoulders at Cleveland Stadium during an Indians game. "I remember that day," Raymond whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "July 4th, 1987. Michael wanted cotton candy and kept asking if the Indians would really win. I told him anything was possible if you believed hard enough." "Do you still believe that?" she asked, holding the photograph so the streetlight illuminated his son's innocent face. "I don't know what I believe anymore." "Then let me show you what belief can accomplish." Her voice carried a gentle authority that brooked no argument. "You have been given a gift, Raymond. 1 day to make amends, 24 hours to heal what has been broken, to speak what has been left unsaid, to love as you should have loved." The photograph began to shimmer in her hands, and suddenly Raymond was no longer lying on cold concrete. He stood in the waiting room of Cleveland General Hospital, watching through a window as his brother Thomas paced beside a hospital bed. But it wasn't Thomas, as Raymond remembered him. This was an older man, grey at the temples, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide the weight of grief in his shoulders. "When was this?" Raymond asked, though part of him already knew. 2 years after you left," she said softly. "Your mother's final day." Through the window, Raymond watched his mother, pale and frail, so different from the strong woman who had raised 2 boys after their father's death. Thomas held her hand while she struggled for each breath, her eyes searching the doorway with desperate hope. "She kept asking for you," the Virgin Mary said. "Thomas called every shelter in Cleveland, checked with every hospital and halfway. In-house, he even hired a private investigator. She died believing you would walk through that door." The scene shifted, and Raymond saw Thomas in the hospital hallway afterward, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A doctor approached with paperwork, and Raymond heard his brother's voice, hollow with exhaustion. He was supposed to be here. She waited for him. "How do I bury our mother without him?" "I didn't know," Raymond gasped. "Nobody told me." "How could they tell you?" she asked gently. "You had disappeared so completely that even your own family couldn't find you. Thomas spent weeks searching, hoping to give you a chance to say goodbye. The vision dissolved, replaced by another scene. Michael, now 17, standing in the parking lot of a rehabilitation center, tears streaming down his face as Sarah tried to console him. The boy looked so much like Raymond at that age, tall and lean, with the same stubborn set to his jaw. "My son," Raymond breathed. "Your son who has been fighting his own demons. The addiction runs in families, Raymond. Michael discovered alcohol. At 14, the same age you did after your father died. By 16, he'd moved on to harder substances. Sarah has been struggling to save him, just as she once tried to save you." Raymond watched his grown son, a stranger wearing a familiar face, argue with his mother about going to treatment. The pain in Michael's eyes was a mirror of Raymond's own. The same desperate attempt to numb feelings too large and painful to carry. "He hates me," Raymond said. "He hates the absence of you," she corrected. "He hates the questions that have no answers, the wound that has never been allowed to heal. When he uses drugs, he's trying to fill the hole his father left behind." The scene changed again. Thomas in his law office, successful and respected, but sitting alone at his desk long after his staff had gone home. On his desk sat a framed photograph, the same one Raymond had been carrying, the three of them at the stadium, that long ago 4th of July. "Thomas built his career on helping families," she explained. "He specializes in cases involving fathers who have abandoned their children. Every client is a chance to right the wrong he couldn't fix in his own family. Every victory in court is an attempt to heal his own heart." "He succeeded," Raymond said. "He became everything he dreamed of being." "Did he? Look closer." Raymond watched his brother pour a drink from a bottle kept hidden in his desk drawer. Not the desperate drinking of an alcoholic, but the careful, controlled drinking of a man who uses alcohol to numb specific pain at specific times. Thomas raised the glass in a toast to the photograph. "Happy birthday, Raymond," his brother said to the empty office. "Wherever you are." The vision faded, leaving Raymond back on the street with tears freezing on his cheeks. The photograph in the Virgin Mary's hands was real again, solid and present. "I destroyed them," he whispered. "You wounded them," she agreed. "But wounds can heal if tended with care. Love can be restored if given the chance to flourish. Faith can return if nurtured with truth." "How? I'm dying, even if I wanted to try." "Are you dying?" she asked again, and this time Raymond noticed something different. The crushing pain in his chest had eased. His breathing, labored and shallow for weeks, came easier now. The constant ache in his bones from the cancer's spread had diminished to a dull whisper. He sat up slowly, expecting the usual wave of dizziness and nausea that accompanied any movement. Instead, he felt steady, clear-headed. Not healthy, he could still feel the cancer's presence, but strengthened, as if some vital force had been renewed within him. "I don't understand." "You have been given grace, Raymond. Not healing in the way you might expect, but something far more precious. Time. Time to speak truth, time to offer love, time to seek forgiveness. What you do with this gift will determine its lasting power." She stood and extended her hand to help him up. Her touch was warm and real, and when Raymond gained his feet, he realized he was standing without pain for the first time in months. "Where do I begin?" "With the hardest truth of all," she said, "that love is not a feeling that comes and goes with circumstances. Love is a choice you make every day, especially on the days when it seems impossible. You chose to leave because staying felt too difficult. Now you must choose to return, even though the return may be far more difficult than the leaving ever was." The photograph dissolved in her hands, but Raymond found he could still see Michael's 5-year-old smile as clearly as if the picture remained. More clearly, in fact, as if the image had been burned into his heart where no wind or weather could fade it. "Thomas will be difficult," she warned. "He has built walls around his pain that will not come down easily. And Michael may reject you entirely. The hurt in him runs deep, and he has learned to protect himself by pushing away anyone who might leave again. What if they won't forgive me?" "Forgiveness is not something you can demand or earn," she said. "It is a gift, freely given or freely withheld. Your job is not to secure their forgiveness, but to offer your truth, your love, and your genuine repentance. The rest is between them and God." The wind picked up again, but it no longer cut through him like a blade. He felt protected, surrounded by an invisible shield of grace that made the cold night air merely crisp rather than brutal. "Will you come with me?" "I am always with you," she said, "though you may not always see me as you do now. When you doubt, when you falter, when the old pride rises up to silence your humility, remember this moment. Remember that you are loved beyond your failures and called to love beyond your fears." She began to fade, her form becoming translucent in the harsh streetlight, but her voice remained clear and strong. "Go to Thomas first. He is expecting you." Expecting me. How could he be expecting me? But she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of roses in the winter air and the impossible gift of hope blooming in Raymond's weathered heart. The downtown offices of Thomas Raymond and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming building on Public Square, a testament to everything Raymond's little brother had accomplished in the years since they'd last spoken. Standing on the sidewalk in his tattered coat and worn shoes, Raymond felt the familiar weight of shame settling over his shoulders like an old, unwelcome friend. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the polished marble lobby, the security desk, the elevator banks that led to worlds he no longer belonged to. A few early commuters hurried past him, their expensive shoes clicking against the pavement, their eyes carefully averted from the homeless man loitering outside their pristine workplace. In his pocket, Raymond's fingers found the business card he'd picked up from the lobby directory. Heavy cardstock with embossed lettering that spoke of success and permanence. Thomas Raymond, senior partner, civil rights law, family advocacy. The same last name they'd both inherited from their father, but Thomas had made it mean something. "Excuse me, sir." A security guard had emerged from the building, his tone professional but firm. "Are you waiting for someone?" "My brother," Raymond said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Thomas Raymond." The guard's expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. "Mr. Raymond doesn't have any appointments this early. Perhaps you'd like to call his office." "Tell him Raymond is here," he said simply. "Just Raymond. He'll know." The guard studied him for a long moment, taking in the hollow cheeks, the grey stubble, the clothes that had seen too many seasons on the street. Whatever he saw in Raymond's eyes must have convinced him, because he nodded and returned to the lobby to make his call. Minutes stretched like hours. Raymond watched office workers stream into the building, their lives ordered and purposeful in ways his had never been. He thought about turning around, walking away, sparing his brother the embarrassment of being connected to Cleveland's invisible underclass. Then the elevator doors opened and Thomas emerged. 15 years had passed since Raymond had seen his brother's face, but he would have recognized him anywhere. The same intelligent brown eyes, the same determined jawline, though both were now framed by silver hair and lines earned through decades of fighting other people's battles. Thomas wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Raymond had seen in the last 5 years combined. They stared at each other across the lobby's expanse, separated by more than just polished marble and potted plants. The security guard watched nervously, his hand drifting toward his radio. "It's all right, Marcus," Thomas said without taking his eyes off Raymond. "This is my brother." The walk to Thomas's office on the 15th floor passed in silence. Raymond tried not to notice the luxury that surrounded them. The original artwork, the Persian rugs, the view of Lake Erie stretching grey and infinite toward the horizon. This was the life Thomas had built, while Raymond had been slowly destroying himself in alleys and shelters. Thomas's office was a monument to achievement. Law degrees from Harvard, professional awards, photographs of Thomas with judges and politicians and community leaders. On his desk sat 2 framed pictures that made Raymond's chest tighten, one of their mother at Christmas 1995, and one of a young man in graduation robes who could only be Michael. "You look terrible," Thomas said, closing the door behind them. "I'm dying," Raymond replied, surprised by how easily the words came. Thomas moved to his desk, but didn't sit down. Instead, he picked up the photograph of their mother, his thumb tracing the edge of the frame. "She waited for you. Right up until the end, she kept asking when you were coming home. I didn't know she was sick." "How could you know?" Thomas's voice carried the weight of 15 years' worth of accumulated anger. "You disappeared. Completely. No forwarding address, no phone number, no way to reach you. Do you have any idea what that was like? Watching her fade away while she kept hoping her firstborn son would walk through the door?" Raymond sank into the chair across from Thomas's desk, his temporary strength wavering under the assault of his brother's pain. "I was ashamed. Ashamed." Thomas set the photograph down with deliberate care. "You were ashamed, so you let our mother die believing she'd failed as a parent? You let me carry the burden of her care alone? You let your son grow up without a father because you were ashamed." Each word hit like a physical blow, but Raymond forced himself not to flinch away from them. This was what he'd come for, to face the truth of what his choices had cost. "Yes," he said simply. Thomas stared at him, clearly expecting more of an explanation, a defense, some attempt to justify the unjustifiable. When none came, he moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Do you remember the night Dad died?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Every detail. You held me while I cried. I was only 12, and you were 14, but you seemed so much older, so much stronger. You told me that we had to take care of each other now, that family was all we had left in the world." Raymond remembered. Their mother working 2 jobs. To keep food on the table, Thomas struggling with homework he was too proud to ask for help with. The weight of being the man of the house settling on Raymond's shoulders like an ill-fitting coat. "I believed you," Thomas continued. "I believed that no matter what happened, we'd always have each other. Even when you started drinking, even when you lost your job at the Cathedral, I believed you'd come back. I kept believing it right up until the day I buried our mother alone. Thomas, I became a lawyer because of you," his brother said, turning from the window. "Every case I take, every family I try to help, I'm trying to fix what you broke. When you walked away, I've reunited hundreds of children with their fathers, but I couldn't bring my own brother home." The pain in Thomas's voice was raw and immediate, as if the wound had never healed but had been carefully covered, hidden, beneath the trappings of success and respectability. "I saw Michael yesterday," Thomas said. "He's in treatment again, 3rd time in 5 years. He keeps asking about you, not directly but in the way he talks about fathers and sons, abandonment and forgiveness. He's fighting the same demons that took you, Raymond, the same ones that killed our father." Raymond's hands shook as the implications settled over him. The generational curse he'd sworn to break had instead been passed down like some terrible inheritance. "I want to see him." "No." Thomas's response was immediate and firm. "You don't get to waltz back into his life just because you're dying. He's finally getting the help he needs. I won't let you destroy that." "I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here to heal what I can." "With what? Good intentions? Deathbed confessions?" "Michael is 22 years old, Raymond. 22 years. Of wondering why his father didn't love him enough to stay. You can't fix that with a conversation." The West Side Recovery Center sat on a tree-lined street that had seen better days, its brick facade weathered but dignified, like an old soldier still standing at attention. Raymond stood across the street, watching visitors come and go, trying to summon the courage to cross those final 50 yards that separated him from his son. On Michael's wrist, barely visible through the window of the common room, was a hospital bracelet from his latest overdose, a thin band of plastic that represented how close Raymond had come to losing his son forever. The bracelet was white with black lettering, sterile and impersonal, but it might as well have been a shackle connecting Michael to a cycle of pain that Raymond had set in motion 26 years ago. "He doesn't want to see you," Thomas had warned that morning. I called ahead, told him you were alive, told him you wanted to meet. He hung up on me. But Raymond had come anyway, drawn by something stronger than fear or pride or even common sense. The Virgin Mary's words echoed in his mind. Love is a choice you make every day, especially on the days when it seems impossible. The lobby smelled of industrial disinfectant and coffee, undercut by the lingering ghost of cigarette smoke from visitors who'd stepped outside to calm their nerves. Raymond approached the reception desk, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes looked up from her computer. "I'm here to see Michael Patterson," he said, using his son's stepfather's surname. "And you are?" "His father." She consulted her screen, frowning slightly. "Mr. Patterson isn't scheduled for any visits today. He specifically requested no visitors, except for his mother and stepfather. Could you tell him Raymond is here? Just Raymond, please?" Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she picked up the phone and spoke quietly into it. Raymond caught fragments of the conversation. "Says he's your father. Just wants to talk. I can ask security to escort him out if you prefer." After what felt like an eternity, she hung up. "He'll see you. Conference room B, down the hall. 15 minutes. The conference room was sterile and windowless, furnished with a round table and uncomfortable chairs that seemed designed to discourage lingering. Michael was already seated when Raymond entered, his back straight, his hands folded on the table like a man preparing for a business negotiation rather than a reunion with his father. He was beautiful and heartbreaking, tall like Raymond had been at his age, with Sarah's dark eyes and delicate features, but carrying himself with the careful control of someone who'd learned not to let his guard down. His hair was shorter than the shaggy style Raymond remembered from the hospital vision, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of recent struggles. "You look like him," Michael said without preamble. "Uncle Thomas, I mean. Same nose, same jawline. I wasn't sure what I expected." "Hello, Michael. It's Mike now. Has been since I was 16. The correction was delivered without heat, but with the precision of someone drawing boundaries. "So, you're dying?" "Yes." "Cancer?" "Yes." "How long?" "The doctors said 6 months. That was 3 months ago." Mike nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "And now you want to make amends. Clear your conscience before you meet your maker. Very considerate of you to fit me into your schedule." The bitterness in his son's voice was a familiar weapon. Raymond had wielded sarcasm and cynicism the same way when he was Mike's age, armor against a world that seemed determined to disappoint him. "I want to explain." "Explain what? How?" "My father decided that a bottle was more important than his family. How he walked away when things got difficult and never looked back. Trust me, I've figured most of it out on my own." Raymond studied his son's face, looking for traces of the little boy who used to wait by the window for Daddy to come home. Instead, he saw a young man who'd learned to expect abandonment, who'd built walls so high and thick that even love might not be able to scale them. "You're angry," Raymond said. "I'm not angry," Mike replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Anger implies that I care. I stopped caring a long time ago." But Raymond could see the lie in the tension around his son's eyes, in the way his hands gripped each other just a little too tightly. Mike cared deeply about the abandonment, about the questions that had never been answered, about the father-shaped hole in his life that he'd been trying to fill with substances and self-destruction. "I never wanted to leave you," Raymond said. "But you did leave. That's the only thing that matters. Your mother." "Don't!" Mike's composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain beneath. "Don't you dare try to blame her for your choices. She gave you every chance to get help, to be the father I needed. You chose the bottle instead." "You're right," Raymond said, and the admission seemed to surprise Mike. "I chose wrong. Every day for years I chose wrong. I chose pride over humility, fear over courage, running away over standing and fighting. I chose to abandon the most precious thing in my life because I was too ashamed to face what I'd become." Mike stared at him, clearly expecting more justification, more deflection. "I destroyed my life," Raymond continued, "and in doing so, I wounded yours. I left you with questions I should have answered, with a wound I should have helped heal, with burdens you were too young to carry. So why didn't you come back?" Mike's voice was quieter now, the angry young man giving way to the confused child who still lived inside him. "Even after you got sober, and I assume you got sober at some point, why didn't you ever try to find me?" "Because I was a coward," Raymond said simply, "because every year that passed made it harder to explain why I'd stayed away so long, because I convinced myself that you and your mother were better off without me, because admitting I was wrong would have meant admitting that I'd wasted not just my life, but years of yours that I could never get back." Mike's hospital bracelet caught the fluorescent light as he shifted in his chair. Such a small thing, that plastic band, but Raymond knew it represented so much more. Medical interventions, worried family members, the dangerous dance between life and death that addiction choreographed. "The drugs," Raymond said carefully. "When did they start?" "When I was 14, same age you were when Grandpa died, according to Uncle Thomas." Mike's smile was bitter. "Funny how these things run in families." "I'm sorry. For what? For passing on your genetic predisposition to addiction? For leaving me with abandonment issues that make it hard to trust anyone? For creating such a perfect storm of psychological damage that substances seemed like the only way to cope?" Each question hit its mark, and Raymond absorbed the impact without flinching. This was his penance, to sit still while his son's pain found voice, to hear the full cost of his choices spelled out in clinical detail. The cathedral renovation plans lay spread across Father Martinez's desk like architectural obituaries, blueprints, and permits that spelled out St. Michael's demolition in precise technical language. Raymond traced the familiar lines of the nave with his finger, remembering every inch of floor he'd swept, every pew he'd polished, every corner where dust liked. Together, the archdiocese received an offer they couldn't refuse, Father Martinez explained, his voice heavy with resignation. "A developer wants to build luxury condominiums. The sale will help fund 3 smaller parishes in the suburbs, serve more families. It makes financial sense." The old priest looked every one of his 78 years, his once dark hair now completely white, his shoulders bent from decades of carrying other people's burdens. But his eyes remained kind, the same eyes that had looked at Raymond with compassion, even on that terrible morning when shame and alcohol had made him desecrate this sacred space. "When?" Raymond asked. "Demolition begins next month. We'll hold our final Mass on Christmas Eve, then the wrecking ball comes after the New Year." Raymond stood and walked to the window that overlooked the nave. The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the empty pews. In the center window, the Virgin Mary gazed down with the same serene expression she'd worn on that frozen street, her arms outstretched in eternal welcome. "I used to know every inch of this place," Raymond said. "Every squeaky floorboard, every stain on the ceiling, every place where the heating vents needed extra attention. It was more than a job. It was a calling. I remember," Father Martinez said, "you treated this building like it was your own home, better than most people treat their homes, actually. The parishioners used to comment on how beautiful everything always looked, how peaceful the space felt. You had a gift for creating sanctuary. A gift. How long since anyone had suggested Raymond possessed something valuable to offer the world?" "I failed you," Raymond said. "I failed this place, failed God, failed everyone who trusted me." "You were human," Father Martinez replied, "flawed and struggling and broken in the ways we all are. The failure wasn't in being imperfect, Raymond. The failure was in believing that your imperfection made you worthless." Raymond turned from the window, studying the priest's weathered face. "Do you believe in miracles, Father? I've seen too. Many not to believe. But I've learned that the greatest miracles aren't always the flashy ones, parting seas and raising the dead. Sometimes the greatest miracle is a heart that learns to hope again. A soul that discovers it can still choose. Love over fear. From his pocket, Raymond withdrew the worn prayer card, its edges soft from decades of handling. She came to me last night, the Blessed Mother, not in a vision or a dream, but real as you are now. She told me I have one day to make amends. Father Martinez studied the card, then looked at Raymond with new attention. What kind of amends? With my family, with my son, with, Raymond gestured around the sanctuary, with this place that I loved and dishonored. The cathedral is going to be demolished, Raymond. There's nothing anyone can do to change that. Maybe there is. For the next hour, Raymond shared his plan, a desperate, probably futile scheme that would require more faith than common sense. Father Martinez listened without interruption, his expression shifting from skepticism to cautious hope. It would take a miracle, the priest said finally. Then it's a good thing we're in the right place to ask for one. They worked through the afternoon, Raymond using strength he shouldn't have possessed to move furniture, clean neglected corners, and restore some measure of dignity to the space that had once been his pride. His hands remembered the work, fell easily into the rhythm of service that had once given his life meaning. As evening approached, people began to arrive. Thomas came first, still wearing his expensive suit, but with his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. He'd brought a crew of law students who volunteered at his firm, young idealists who believed in fighting impossible battles. I still think, "You're crazy," Thomas said, surveying the renovation plans spread across a folding table in the vestibule. "But maybe crazy is what this situation requires." Sarah arrived with her husband David, a quiet man with carpenter's hands who studied the building structure with professional interest. Behind them came Mike, still wearing his hospital bracelet, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes alert and curious. "Mom said you were trying to save the cathedral," Mike said, approaching Raymond cautiously. "That true?" "I'm trying to save. Something worth saving," Raymond replied. "Something beautiful that shouldn't be lost just because it's old and needs work." Mike nodded slowly, understanding the metaphor without it needing to be spelled out. More volunteers appeared as word spread through the neighborhood. Former parishioners, community activists, Preservation Society members who'd been fighting lost causes for decades. They brought tools and supplies, coffee and sandwiches, stories, and memories of what St. Michael's had meant to their families. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 70s, remembered her wedding at the altar 30 years ago. Raymond made sure every flower was perfect, every candle straight. He understood that this was the most important day of our lives. James Patterson, Thomas's age, recalled his confirmation ceremony. "I was so nervous, but Raymond gave me a peppermint and told me God loved me just as I was. That meant everything to a scared 13-year-old. Story after story emerged from the gathering crowd. Baptisms and funerals, First Communions and Golden Anniversary Masses, Christmas pageants and Easter vigils. Each memory was a thread in the fabric of community that St. Michael's had woven over more than a century. As they worked, Raymond noticed changes in the people around him. Thomas, initially skeptical, found himself caught up in the project's energy, his legal mind already strategizing media campaigns and political pressure. Sarah, cautious about involving Mike in anything that might trigger his addiction, watched. Her son find purpose in physical labor that demanded focus and commitment. And Mike himself seemed different, less guarded, more present. Working alongside his father for the first time in his memory, he began asking questions about the cathedral's history, about Raymond's years as custodian, about the life he'd built, and lost in this sacred space. "You really love this place," Mike observed, watching Raymond run his hand along a wooden pew with the familiarity of long practice. "I did," Raymond admitted. "It was the closest thing to home I ever had after your grandfather died. Every morning when I unlocked those doors, I felt like I was stepping into something larger than myself, something that would last long after I was gone. And now it's going to be torn down. Maybe, or maybe love is stronger than economics." Maybe beauty has value that can't be measured in dollars and cents. Maybe some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible. The rosary beads appeared in Raymond's hands as he knelt in prayer before the altar, their ancient wood worn smooth by countless fingers, their silver chain catching the candlelight like captured stars. He hadn't seen them materialize. One moment, his hands were empty. The next they held this sacred gift, as if the Virgin Mary had placed them there while he was lost in meditation. 3 days had passed since the campaign to save St. Michael's began, and the cathedral had transformed into something Raymond barely recognized, a bustling hub of activity where strangers became allies, and old wounds began to heal through shared purpose. The local news had picked up the story. Social media was buzzing with support, and volunteers arrived daily with donations and determination. "The city council meets tomorrow," Thomas said, joining his brother in the front pew. "I've got 3 council members who are sympathetic, 2 who are definitely against us, and 2 who could go either way. It's going to be close." Raymond fingered the rosary beads, each one smooth as river stone, warm as if recently held by loving hands. "How are the finances looking?" "Better than expected. The Preservation Society has pledged 50,000. The Historical Commission approved emergency funding for another 30,000, and the online fundraiser is approaching 200,000. It's not enough to match the developer's offer, but it's enough to show serious community support." Through the cathedral's tall windows, Raymond could see Mike organizing a group of teenagers from the recovery center, teaching them how to properly clean the brass fixtures. The young people hung on his every word, drawn to his combination of street wisdom and hard-won hope. In helping others, Mike seemed to be finding pieces of himself he'd thought were lost forever. "He's a natural leader," Thomas observed, following Raymond's gaze. "Always has been, even as a kid. Sarah used to say he got that from you. I was never much of a leader, more of a follower who happened to find something worth following. Maybe that's what real leadership is, knowing what's worth following, and helping others see it too." The rosary beads seemed to pulse with warmth in Raymond's hands, and he found himself remembering the prayers his mother had taught him as a child. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." Words that had once felt like empty ritual now carried the weight of lived experience, each syllable connected to the woman who had knelt beside him on that frozen street and changed everything. Sarah approached from the vestibule, her face flushed with excitement. "Channel 5 wants to do a live broadcast from here tomorrow evening. They're calling it A Community Fights to Save Its Heart. The anchor is that young woman who won the Emmy for her series on urban renewal." "More exposure is good," Thomas said. But Raymond detected worry in his voice. "What's troubling you?" Raymond asked. "The developer isn't going to take this lying down." Richard Blackwood didn't become a millionaire by letting community sentiment override profit margins. He's going to fight back, and when he does, it's going to get ugly. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a sleek black sedan pulled up outside the cathedral. Richard Blackwood emerged, a man in his 60s wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a month. With him came 2 younger men in equally expensive attire and a woman carrying a briefcase that screamed legal consequences. "Speak of the devil," Thomas muttered. Blackwood strode into the cathedral with the confidence of someone who'd never met an obstacle he couldn't buy his way around. His eyes swept the sanctuary with the calculating gaze of someone who saw square footage and profit margins where others saw beauty and history. "Quite the little production you've got going here," he said, his voice carrying easily through the vaulted space. "Very touching, very quaint." Father Martinez emerged from the sacristy, his clerical collar straight and his dignity intact, despite the obvious intimidation tactics. "Mr. Blackwood, what brings you to St. Michael's?" "Business, Father. Pure and simple. I have a signed contract with the Archdiocese, permits from the city, and a construction crew scheduled to begin work next month. This little Protest is nothing more than a delay tactic that's costing me money. This is a house of worship, Father Martinez replied calmly. People have every right to pray for guidance and work to preserve what they love. And I have every right to proceed with a legal business transaction. Blackwood's gaze settled on Raymond, taking in the worn clothes, the hollow cheeks, the obvious signs of illness. You must be the famous janitor I've been hearing about. The prodigal son returned to save the family church. Very dramatic. Raymond stood slowly, the rosary beads still warm in his palm. Up close, Blackwood was smaller than he'd appeared from a distance, but his presence filled the space like a bad smell. Everything about him spoke of power wielded without conscience, success achieved at others' expense. I'm Raymond, he said simply. The drunk who abandoned his family and now wants to play hero. Yes, I've done my research. It's amazing what private investigators can dig up when properly motivated. Your son's addiction problems, your brother's drinking habits, your ex-wife's financial struggles. All very compelling television, I'm sure. Mike had stopped his work with the brass fixtures and moved closer, his young face flushed with anger. Leave my family out of this. Your family made themselves part of this when they decided to interfere with my business interests, Blackwood replied smoothly. But I'm not unreasonable. I'm prepared to make a generous offer to end this nonsense peacefully. He gestured to the woman with the briefcase, who produced a folder of documents. I'm prepared to donate $100,000 to a charity of your choice if you end this campaign and allow the demolition to proceed on schedule. Think of the good that money could do, feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, treating addiction. Surely that's more valuable than preserving one old building. The offer hung in the air like incense, sweet and tempting. Raymond could see the calculation in people's faces. $100,000 was real money that could address real needs. The cathedral would be demolished either way. At least this way something positive would come from its destruction. No, Raymond said quietly. I'm sorry. I said no. Raymond's voice was stronger now, carrying a conviction that surprised even him. Some things aren't for sale, Mr. Blackwood. Some things have value that can't be measured in dollars. Everything has a price, Mr. Raymond. I've learned that over 30 years in development. The only question is whether you're smart enough to accept a reasonable offer or foolish enough to force me to take other measures. What other measures? Thomas asked, his lawyer instincts kicking in. Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, there's the matter of building code violations. This structure is over a century old. I'm sure a thorough inspection would turn up numerous safety issues that would require immediate evacuation. There's also the question of permit compliance for your little renovation project. And then there are the personal issues, unpaid debts, past legal troubles, immigration status for some of your volunteers. It's remarkable how quickly community support can evaporate when people's own situations come under scrutiny. The threat was clear, delivered with the casual malice of someone who destroyed opposition many times before. But instead of intimidating the volunteers, Blackwood's words seemed to galvanize them. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her elderly frame radiating defiance. You can threaten all you want, Mr. Blackwood. This church has survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and urban decline. It will survive you too. Others joined her. James Patterson, the teenagers from the recovery center, law students from Thomas's firm, neighbors who'd grown up in the shadow of St. Michael's spires. One by one, they formed a human barrier around the altar, their faces set with quiet determination. Blackwood's composure slipped slightly. He'd expected fear, compliance, the usual capitulation of ordinary people when faced with superior force. Instead, he found something he didn't know how to buy or intimidate, genuine faith in something larger than self-interest. You're making a mistake, he said finally, all of you. When this is over, when your little crusade collapses under the weight of reality, remember that I offered you a way out. He turned to leave, but Raymond's voice stopped him. Mr. Blackwood, the developer turned back, irritation clear on his face. You asked what this place is worth to us. Let me show you. Raymond knelt at the altar and began to pray, the ancient words of the rosary flowing from his lips with newfound meaning. One by one, others joined him. Father Martinez, Thomas, Mike, Sarah, strangers and family united in common purpose. The sound of their voices rose through the vaulted space, carried by acoustics designed to lift human song toward heaven. It was beautiful and haunting, a sound that spoke of endurance and hope, of faith tested by fire and refined by struggle. Blackwood stood frozen, perhaps remembering his own childhood, his own abandoned faith, the things he'd lost in his relentless pursuit of profit. For a moment, his hard facade wavered, revealing something almost human underneath. Then, the moment passed. He straightened his shoulders, signaled to his associates, and walked out of the cathedral without another word. But Raymond noticed he didn't slam the door. The medical report lay on Dr. Sarah Chen's desk like an impossible riddle. Its clinical language struggling to describe something that defied scientific explanation. Raymond sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair across from her, still clutching the rosary beads that had become his constant companion, while Thomas and Mike flanked him like bodyguards protecting against bad news. "I need you to understand," Dr. Chen said carefully, "that I've been practicing oncology for 23 years. I've seen spontaneous remissions, unexpected responses to treatment, cases where patients exceeded all statistical probabilities. But I have never seen anything quite like this." She turned her computer monitor so they could see the scan images, before and after pictures, that told a story no medical textbook could explain. The first set, taken 3 months earlier, showed Raymond's lungs riddled with dark masses. Cancer, spreading like spilled ink through his chest cavity. The second set, taken that morning, showed clear, healthy tissue. "The tumors are gone," she said simply. "Not reduced, not stabilized, not responding to treatment, because you haven't had any treatment. They're simply gone." Mike leaned forward, studying the images with the intensity of someone who'd learned not to trust good news too easily. "What does that mean? Is he cured?" "I don't know what it means," Dr. Chen admitted. "Medically speaking, this shouldn't be possible. Cancer doesn't just disappear overnight. There has to be an explanation. Immune system response, misdiagnosis, some factor we're not seeing." "But he's going to live?" Thomas asked, his lawyer's precision demanding clear answers. "Based on these scans, there's no reason he shouldn't have a normal lifespan. His heart function has improved, his blood work is better than patients half his age, and his overall physical condition is—" She paused, searching for words. "Remarkable for a man who's been homeless and malnourished for years." Raymond felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes turning toward him, waiting for his reaction to news that should have filled him with joy. Instead, he felt a strange mixture of gratitude and fear, as if he'd been given a gift too large to comprehend. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what? How long do I have to live?" Dr. Chen removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, the gesture of someone who'd run out of medical certainties. "Mr. Raymond, if these scans are accurate, you could live another 20 years, maybe more." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the hum of medical equipment and the distant sounds of hospital life continuing beyond the closed door. 20 years, 2 decades to face the consequences of his choices, to live with the family he'd abandoned, to prove that his transformation was genuine rather than the desperate grabbing of a dying man. "I need some air," Raymond said, standing abruptly and walking out of the office before anyone could respond. He found himself in the hospital's garden, a small oasis of green tucked between concrete buildings, designed to offer comfort to patients and families grappling with mortality. The autumn afternoon was crisp, the leaves on the maple trees turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Having second thoughts, the Virgin Mary sat on a bench beside a fountain, her blue robe as radiant as ever, her presence as calming as that first night on the frozen street. but something in her expression suggested this conversation would be different from their earlier encounters. "I thought I was dying," Raymond said, sinking onto the bench beside her. "I thought I had one day to make amends and then peace, rest, an end to the struggle. And now I have to live with what I've done. 20 years of explaining, of trying to be the father and brother I never was, of facing people who have every right to doubt my sincerity. When you're dying, people forgive you because death makes saints of us all. But when you're going to live, you have to earn forgiveness through actions rather than sentiment," she finished. "You have to prove that change is real rather than temporary." Raymond fingered the rosary beads, their warmth a reminder of grace freely given but not easily maintained. "I don't know if I'm strong enough. The old patterns, the old temptations, they're still there waiting. What if I disappoint them again? What if I prove that leopards really can't change their spots?" "What if you don't?" she asked gently. "What if this gift of time allows you to become the man you were always meant to be? What if your second chance inspires others to believe in their own possibility for redemption?" Through the garden's windows, Raymond could see Thomas and Mike in animated conversation with Dr. Chen, their faces a mixture of hope and concern. His family, the people he'd wounded most deeply and who now had to decide whether to trust him. "With their hearts again. They're afraid," he said. "Of course they are. Love makes us vulnerable. The greater the love, the greater the vulnerability. They loved you once, with the pure trust of family bonds, and that love was betrayed. Now they must choose whether to risk loving you again, knowing that this time the stakes are even higher. And Mike, he's still struggling with addiction. What kind of example am I? A drunk who walked away when life got difficult and now claims to be transformed by divine intervention? It sounds like the desperate fantasy of someone who can't face reality. Does it?" she asked. "Or does it sound like the story of every human soul, broken by pride, redeemed by grace, called to something greater than their failures?" Raymond watched a sparrow land near the fountain, its tiny head cocked as if listening to their conversation. Such a small creature, but it sang with the full power of its lungs, as if its voice mattered in the grand chorus of creation. "The Cathedral campaign," he said. "If I'm going to live, people will expect me to see it through. But what if we lose? What if all this hope and effort amounts to nothing? What if I've led them into a battle we can't win?" "Then you will have led them into a battle worth fighting," she replied. "Victory is not always measured by the outcome, Raymond. Sometimes it's measured by the courage to stand for something beautiful in a world that often values only the profitable." The sparrow finished its song and flew away, disappearing into the maze of city buildings beyond the garden walls. Raymond thought about the volunteers at St. Michael's, united in common purpose for the first time in years, finding meaning in something larger than their individual struggles. "The young people at the recovery center," he said. "They're watching." Mike learning from his example. If he can find hope after addiction, maybe they can too. And Thomas, he's been fighting other families' battles for years, but now he's fighting for his own family. Maybe that's what he needed all along. And you, what do you need? Raymond considered the question, surprised by the answer that emerged. "I need to stop being afraid of disappointing people and start being grateful for the chance to try. I need to stop viewing this second chance as a burden and start seeing it as the gift it is." The Virgin Mary smiled, and in that expression Raymond saw not the serene, untouchable figure of stained glass windows, but a mother who understood the messy complexity of human love, the daily choice to forgive and be forgiven, the courage required to keep hoping when hope seemed foolish. "Your real miracle isn't the healing of your body," she said. "It's the healing of your capacity to love without guarantees, to serve without recognition, to hope without certainty. The cancer was never your greatest illness, Raymond. Fear was. Fear of inadequacy, fear of rejection, fear of facing the truth about yourself and others. And now you have the rest of your life to practice courage instead of fear, love. Instead of withdrawal, hope instead of despair. Now you have the opportunity to show your son that redemption is possible, to show your brother that family bonds can be restored, to show your community that some things are worth fighting for, even when victory seems impossible. She began to fade, her form becoming translucent in the afternoon light, but her voice remained clear and strong. The choice is yours, Raymond. You can spend the next 20 years proving you deserve this second chance, or you can spend them being grateful for it and using it to serve something larger than yourself. Only one of those paths leads to peace. As her presence faded completely, Raymond felt the weight of the rosary beads in his hands and the weight of possibility in his heart. Through the garden windows, he could see Thomas and Mike walking toward the exit, probably looking for him, ready to face whatever came next as a family. He stood, straightened his shoulders, and went to meet them. The cathedral cornerstone had waited in silence for over a century, holding its secrets like a faithful guardian. Now, as Raymond knelt beside the massive granite block with a crowbar and hammer, dozens of people gathered around him in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces illuminated by work lights and the kind of desperate hope that comes when all conventional options have been exhausted. "The time capsule should be right behind this panel," said Margaret Holbrook, the elderly archivist who'd spent 3 days researching the cathedral's construction records. The cornerstone was laid in 1892, and it was traditional to include documents and artifacts that would tell future generations about the people who built these sacred spaces. Thomas checked his watch nervously. "The city council meeting starts in 6 hours. If we're going to present new evidence for the historical designation, we need to find something significant." The past week had been a whirlwind of legal maneuvers and media attention. Blackwood's threats had backfired spectacularly, generating sympathy for the cathedral's cause and bringing national attention to Cleveland's preservation battle. But sympathy alone wouldn't save St. Michael's. They needed something concrete, something that would give the building protected historical status. Raymond worked carefully with the crowbar, trying not to damage the cornerstone while prying away. The lead seal that had protected the time capsule for 130 years. His hands were steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting, guided by the same attention to detail that had once made him the cathedral's most trusted caretaker. Mike knelt beside him, holding a flashlight and offering quiet encouragement. The past week had transformed their relationship in ways that still surprised them both. Working side by side to save the cathedral, they'd found a rhythm of cooperation that felt natural despite decades of separation. "Got it," Raymond said as the seal finally gave way. Behind it was a copper box, green with oxidation but intact. With reverent hands, he lifted it from its resting place and set it on a cloth that Sarah had spread on the ground. Father Martinez stepped forward to offer a blessing before they opened the box. In the flickering light of the work lamps, his weathered face looked like something from a medieval painting, etched with lines that spoke of a lifetime spent serving others. "Lord, let what we find here serve your greater purpose," he prayed. Simply, Raymond opened the copper box with the careful attention of someone handling holy relics. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived more than a century, were documents, photographs, and artifacts from St. Michael's founding generation. The first item was a letter, written in the careful script of the Victorian era. To those who will read this in years to come, we leave this record of our hopes and dreams. We have built this cathedral not for ourselves alone, but for generations yet unborn, that they might have a place of beauty and peace in whatever storms may come. We were immigrants and refugees, workers and dreamers, bound together by faith in something greater than our individual struggles. May this building stand as long as human hearts need sanctuary, and may those who care for it know they are part of a sacred trust. It was signed by Patrick O'Malley, Master Stonemason, and dated September 15, 1892. Margaret Holbrook gasped as she examined the signature. Patrick O'Malley was the most famous cathedral builder in the Midwest. He designed St. Patrick's in Chicago and Sacred Heart in Detroit. If he was the master mason here, this building has architectural significance we never knew about. More documents emerged from the box. Architectural drawings in O'Malley's own hand, showing innovative structural techniques that had influenced church design across the region. Photographs of the immigrant families who had sacrificed to fund the construction. Personal letters describing the cathedral as a symbol of hope for people struggling to build new lives in a new country. But it was the final item that made everyone fall silent. A small wooden cross, hand-carved and polished smooth by countless prayers, wrapped in a piece of silk that bore the unmistakable mark of having been worn close to someone's heart. Attached to the cross was a note in different handwriting. This cross belonged to my son Timothy, killed in the mine collapse of 1891. He was 19 years old and dreamed of being a teacher. I place it here so that his sacrifice might be part of something beautiful, something lasting. Let this building stand as a prayer for all the children who will never grow old, and let their dreams live on in stone and glass and song. It was signed Mary O'Malley, and dated the same day as her husband's letter. The silence stretched on as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a building, it was a memorial, a prayer in stone and stained glass, built by people who knew firsthand the cost of dreams deferred and lives cut short. The Historical Commission has to see this, Thomas said finally. This changes everything. A cathedral designed by Patrick O'Malley, built as a memorial to industrial accident victims, representing the immigrant experience in Cleveland. This is exactly the kind of historical significance that can override commercial interests. Raymond held the wooden cross carefully, feeling the weight of Timothy O'Malley's unlived life in his hands. He thought about Michael, about second chances and dreams that sometimes get a reprieve from tragedy. We need to get these documents authenticated and catalogued, Margaret said, her archivist training kicking in. I know people at Case Western who can verify the papers and establish provenance. How long will that take? Mike asked. If we work through the night, we can have preliminary authentication by morning. But the city council meets at noon. Then we work through the night, Raymond said simply, whatever it takes. The next few hours passed in a blur of careful documentation and frantic phone calls. Margaret's contacts at the university worked with unprecedented speed, driven by the story emerging from the time capsule. Thomas coordinated with the Historical Commission, the Preservation Society, and media outlets that had been following the cathedral story. As dawn broke over Cleveland, painting the cathedral spires gold against the grey sky, they had what they needed: authenticated documents proving St. Michael's architectural and historical significance, testimony from experts who could speak to its importance, and a story that connected past and present in ways that touched the heart as well as the mind. But Blackwood wasn't conceding defeat easily. His lawyers filed last-minute challenges to the historical designation process, questioning the authenticity of the documents and the jurisdiction of various review boards. The corporate machinery that had seemed so overwhelming when focused on profit was equally formidable when fighting to protect those profits. He's trying to delay the council vote, Thomas explained as they gathered in the cathedral for final preparations. If he can tie this up in procedural challenges long enough, his demolition permits expire, and he has legal grounds to proceed regardless of what the council decides. How long do we have? Father Martinez asked. The demolition crew is scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning. If the council doesn't vote today, or if they vote against historical designation, Blackwood can proceed with teardown. Raymond looked around at the people who had gathered to make this final stand. Elderly parishioners who remembered being baptized at this altar. Young families who wanted their children to experience the same beauty their grandparents had known. Neighbors who understood that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Then we make our case, and trust in something larger than our own abilities, he said. We've done everything humanly possible, Now we leave. Room for Grace to work. Mike approached, carrying the wooden cross they'd found in the cornerstone. Dad, I want you to have this. For luck. Raymond started to protest. The cross belonged in a museum, or at least with the Historical Society, but something in his son's expression stopped him. This wasn't about luck. It was about faith passing from one generation to the next, about the belief that some battles are worth fighting, regardless of the outcome. Thank you, he said simply, accepting the cross and the trust it represented. As they prepared to leave for City Hall, Raymond took one last look around the sanctuary that had shaped so much of his life, the place where he'd found purpose, lost his way, and somehow found redemption. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he knew he'd given everything he had to preserve something beautiful for future generations. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns across the empty pews, as if the building itself was offering a benediction for the battle ahead. The demolition notice was taped to St. Michael's front doors like a death warrant, its official city seal gleaming in the morning sunlight. Structural demolition authorized. Area to be cleared by 8 a.m. The document declared in bureaucratic language that reduced a century of faith and community to a scheduling issue. Raymond stood before the cathedral steps as the demolition crew unloaded their equipment. A massive wrecking ball, hydraulic excavators, trucks that would haul away the rubble that had once been stained glass windows and hand-carved stone. The crew chief, a weathered man named Frank Kowalski, approached with the resigned professionalism of someone who'd torn down too many beautiful things in the name of progress. "Sorry about this, pal," Frank said, genuinely sympathetic. "I've demolished a lot of buildings in 30 years, but churches always feel different, like you're tearing down more than just brick and mortar." "You don't have to do this," Raymond said. "The city council meets in 4 hours. If they vote for historical designation, then my company gets sued for breach of contract," Frank interrupted. "Mr. Blackwood made it very clear that any delays would result in legal action against us personally. I've got 18 guys on this crew who need their jobs." Behind the police barriers, a crowd had gathered despite the early hour. Former parishioners, neighborhood residents, preservation activists, and supporters who had followed the story through social media and news. Coverage. They held signs reading "Save St. Michael's" and "History Matters," their faces a mixture of hope and desperation. Thomas arrived with his legal team, carrying briefcases full of injunctions and emergency motions. But Raymond could see in his brother's expression that the law had reached its limits. Sometimes justice moved too slowly to save what needed saving. "The Historical Commission agreed to expedite their review," Thomas said, slightly out of breath. "But Blackwood's lawyers are challenging their jurisdiction. They're claiming the building doesn't meet the age requirements for emergency designation." "What age requirements?" "Buildings have to be at least 50 years old for standard historical protection, but there are emergency provisions for structures of exceptional significance. The problem is proving exceptional significance in a way that holds up in court." Mike appeared with a group of young people from the recovery center, their faces determined despite their youth. In their hands they carried flowers, daisies, and carnations purchased with pooled lunch money, a gesture both humble and defiant. "We wanted to be here," Mike said simply. "This place matters to people. It should matter to the city, too." The media had arrived in force, drawn by the David and Goliath narrative of a community fighting corporate power. Television crews set up their cameras, reporters interviewed crowd members, and photographers captured images of the wrecking ball posed against the cathedral's Gothic spires like some medieval siege engine. Father Martinez emerged from the cathedral, carrying the chalice and other sacred items that had been removed the night before. His face was composed, but Raymond could see the pain in his eyes as he watched demolition equipment surround the building that had been his life's work. 43 years I've served this parish," the old priest said quietly. "Married over 8. 100 couples, baptized more than 2,000 children, said funeral masses for 3 generations of families. Every stone in this building holds memories, every window tells a story, and in 4 hours it'll be rubble. At 8 a.m. sharp, Frank Kowalski gave the signal to begin. The crowd fell silent as the excavator's arm extended toward the cathedral's eastern wall, its hydraulic claw reaching for the first bite of century-old brick. That's when Raymond stepped forward. He walked past the police barriers, past the shouting officers, past the demolition crew's startled protests, and stood directly in front of the excavator. The machine stopped just feet from where he stood, its diesel engine idling like some mechanical beast held temporarily at bay. "Sir, you need to move away from the equipment," Frank called out, his voice carrying both authority and concern. "No," Raymond said simply. Within moments, others joined him. Mike was the first, taking his place beside his father with the quiet courage of someone who'd learned that some things were worth risking for. Then Sarah, her face pale but determined. Then Thomas, abandoning his legal briefs for direct action. Then Father Martinez, still clutching the chalice, his cassock billowing in the morning wind. One by one, the crowd behind the barriers began to move forward. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 70s, walked slowly but steadily to stand with them. James Patterson left his car running in the middle of the street to join the human wall. Teenagers from the recovery center linked arms with elderly parishioners, creating a chain of bodies between the demolition equipment and the cathedral. The police were shouting, the demolition crew was shouting, reporters were shouting questions. But in the center of the chaos was an island of quiet determination. People who had decided that some things were worth standing for, regardless of the consequences. Frank Kowalski shut off the excavator and pulled out his phone, clearly calling for instructions on how to handle a situation that had moved far beyond his experience. Raymond looked up at the stained glass window above the cathedral's entrance, the Virgin Mary, with her arms outstretched, serene and eternal. For just a moment, he thought he saw her smile. The anonymous donation check arrived at exactly 11:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the City Council was scheduled to vote on St. Michael's historical designation. Thomas received the call from his office while standing in the human chain that still surrounded the cathedral, his phone buzzing insistently against the backdrop of news helicopters and police negotiations. "Thomas Raymond speaking," he answered, never taking his eyes off the demolition equipment that waited like hungry predators for the standoff to end. "Mr. Raymond, this is Patricia Kellerman from First National Bank. We have a certified check here made out to the St. Michael's Cathedral Preservation Fund. The amount is $2.7 million. Thomas almost dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" $2.7 million. The donor wishes to remain anonymous, but the check is legitimate and the funds have been verified. The donor left specific instructions that the money should be used to purchase the cathedral from the Archdiocese and establish a community trust for its preservation. Through the crowd of protesters, Thomas caught Raymond's eye and gestured frantically. His brother stepped away from the human chain, leaving Mike to take his place in the line of bodies protecting the cathedral. "Who is the donor?" Thomas asked, though he suspected the answer. The donor specifically requested anonymity. "I can tell you that the check was delivered by messenger with instructions that it should be made available immediately if the cathedral was in danger of demolition." Thomas hung up and grabbed Raymond's arm. "We need to get to City Hall, now!" The ride through downtown Cleveland felt surreal, as if they were racing through a dream where impossible things had suddenly become possible. Raymond clutched the wooden cross from the time capsule, while Thomas made frantic calls to council members, reporters, and anyone else who needed to know that the game had fundamentally changed. $2.7 million, Thomas repeated, still hardly believing it. "That's enough to buy the cathedral outright and fund renovation for the next decade." Whoever did this essentially just saved St. Michael's with a single check. Any idea who it could be? Thomas shook his head, but something in his expression suggested he had suspicions he wasn't ready to voice. The city council chambers were packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in the hallway and lobby. The preservation supporters sat on one side, wearing their Save St. Michael's buttons and clutching photos of family. Celebrations held in the cathedral. Blackwood's representatives occupied the other side, lawyers and development company executives in expensive suits, their expressions confident despite the morning's protests. Council President Maria Santos called for order as Thomas rushed to the podium, still catching his breath from the sprint across downtown. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council," Thomas began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent his career arguing impossible cases. 30 minutes ago, the St. Michael's Cathedral Preservation Fund received an anonymous donation of $2.7 million, specifically designated for purchasing and preserving the cathedral. The chamber erupted in gasps and applause. Blackwood's lawyers huddled together in urgent consultation while the developer himself sat stone-faced, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. This donation, combined with the historical documentation discovered in the cathedral's cornerstone, provides both the financial means and the cultural justification for preserving this irreplaceable piece of Cleveland's heritage. Thomas presented the evidence systematically. Patrick O'Malley's architectural drawings, proving the cathedral's design significance, the immigrant family's letters, establishing its cultural importance, the memorial cross, demonstrating its role as a community, touchstone for generations of working-class families. Blackwood's lead attorney rose to object, citing contract law and development rights, but his argument sounded hollow against the weight of history and the reality of sufficient funding. The mysterious donation had eliminated the economic argument. That had been his strongest weapon. When the vote was called, it wasn't even close. 7 council members voted for historical designation, with only 2 dissenting, both of whom had been known to have business relationships with Blackwood's development company. The chamber erupted in celebration, but Raymond felt oddly quiet in the center of the storm. As reporters surged forward with questions and supporters embraced each other with tears of joy, he found himself thinking about the anonymous donor who had made this victory possible. Outside City Hall, the crowd from the cathedral had grown to several hundred people, their vigil transformed into a victory celebration. Someone had brought speakers and was playing hymns. Others had set up tables with food and coffee. Children ran between the adults with the kind of joy that comes from witnessing adults successfully fight for something beautiful. Mike approached, his hospital bracelet catching the afternoon sunlight. "Dad, who do you think made the donation?" Raymond looked across the crowd and spotted a familiar figure standing quietly at the edge of the celebration. Richard Blackwood, no longer surrounded by lawyers and assistants, watching the joy of the crowd with an expression that might have been regret. "I think," Raymond said slowly, "that sometimes grace works in ways we don't expect, through people we'd never suspect." As if sensing their attention, Blackwood met Raymond's gaze across the crowd. For a moment, something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition of shared humanity beneath the roles they'd been playing. Then Blackwood nodded once, turned, and walked away into the gathering dusk. 1 year later, the new stained glass window was installed on a crisp October morning that felt like a blessing. Raymond stood in the cathedral nave, watching as the craftsman carefully positioned the final panel, a luminous depiction of the Virgin Mary kneeling beside a homeless man on a city street, her blue robe flowing like water, her face radiant with compassion. "It's perfect," Sarah said, joining him at the altar rail. She wore the same expression of quiet wonder that had marked so many moments in this remarkable year of restoration and renewal. The window had been Mike's idea, commissioned with a portion of the preservation fund and designed by a local artist who had donated her services after hearing the cathedral's story. In the corner of the scene, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a small brass plaque, In memory of Timothy O'Malley, 1872–1891, and all whose dreams live on in those who remember them. Raymond's fingers found the wooden cross in his pocket, Timothy's cross, which he now carried as a daily reminder that second chances were sacred gifts not to be wasted. The cross had become smooth from handling, worn by prayers and gratitude, that had become as natural as breathing. "The dedication ceremony is in an hour," Thomas said, approaching with an armload of programs. His expensive suits had given way to more casual attire since he'd begun spending his Saturdays volunteering at the Cathedral, organizing legal aid clinics for families struggling with addiction and abandonment issues. The transformation in Thomas had been gradual but profound. Winning other families' court battles had never healed the wound in his own heart, but rebuilding his relationship with Raymond had given him something no legal victory could provide: the peace that comes from forgiveness freely given and received. "How many people are we expecting?" Raymond asked. "About 400. The mayor's coming, along with representatives from the Historical Society and the Preservation Commission. Channel 5 wants to do a follow-up story on the Cathedral's first year as a community trust." Father Martinez emerged from the sacristy, moving more slowly than he had a year ago, but with the satisfied bearing of someone who had seen his life's work preserved for future generations. At 79, he'd officially retired, but he still said Mass twice a week and served as the cathedral's unofficial historian. "The flowers arrived this morning," he reported. "Mrs. Rodriguez insisted on doing the arrangements herself, despite her arthritis. She said this is too important to trust to anyone else." Through the tall windows, Raymond could see the neighborhood that had slowly begun to flourish around the preserved cathedral. Property values had risen as young families moved in, drawn by the area's renewed sense of community. Small businesses had opened on nearby streets: a bookstore, a coffee shop, an art gallery that featured local craftspeople. The cathedral itself had become more than a preserved building. It had become a community center that hosted AA meetings, job training programs, and support groups for families dealing with addiction. Mike had been instrumental in developing these programs, his own recovery journey giving him credibility with people who'd learned to be suspicious of easy answers. "Dad, you ready for this?" Mike asked, appearing at Raymond's shoulder. He wore a suit for the occasion, but more importantly, he wore the quiet confidence of someone who'd found his purpose. 6 months clean, and working as a counselor at the recovery center, Mike had become living proof that transformation was possible. "Ready as I'll ever be," Raymond replied, though he still felt overwhelmed by the idea of being honored for simply doing what love required. The ceremony began with hymns that filled the vaulted space with the kind of beauty that makes hearts soar and eyes fill with tears. The mayor spoke about community activism and historic preservation. The archbishop offered prayers of gratitude for the cathedral's continuation. Representatives from various organizations thanked the anonymous donor whose generosity had made everything possible. When it came time for Raymond to speak, he approached the pulpit with the same careful attention he'd once brought to sweeping these floors. The faces looking up at him were familiar now. Neighbors who'd become friends, strangers who'd become family, people whose lives had been touched by the miracle of a community that refused to let beauty die. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I was prepared to die on a frozen street, forgotten and alone. I thought my story was ending. Instead, it was just beginning." He talked about second chances and the courage to hope when hope seemed foolish. He spoke about the importance of preserving beautiful things for future generations, about the way love multiplies when shared rather than hoarded. He thanked the anonymous donor whose generosity had saved not just a building, but an entire community's sense of possibility. This cathedral stands today not because of any one person's efforts, but because a community decided that some things are worth fighting for. It stands because people chose hope over despair, beauty over profit, love over fear. As applause filled the sanctuary, Raymond's eyes found the new stained glass window, where light, streaming through colored glass, painted rainbow patterns on the walls. In that light, he saw reflections of everyone who had played a part in this unlikely story. Thomas, whose legal skills had navigated impossible bureaucracies. Mike, whose recovery had inspired other young people to believe in their own possibilities. Sarah, whose quiet strength had held the family together through decades of uncertainty. Father Martinez, whose faith had provided the foundation for everything else. But mostly, he saw the Virgin Mary, her arms still outstretched in eternal welcome, her face serene with the knowledge that love is stronger than death, hope more powerful than despair, and grace more abundant than any human heart can fully comprehend. The dedication ceremony ended with the same hymn that had been sung at the cathedral's original consecration in 1892. How great thou art! As hundreds of voices joined together in praise, Raymond felt the presence he'd first encountered on that frozen street. Not visible now, but no less real. Some miracles, he'd learned, don't announce themselves with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they whisper themselves into being through ordinary people making extraordinary choices, through love persisting when logic suggests surrender, through communities that refuse to let hope die. Outside, Cleveland continued its ancient rhythms of struggle and renewal. But inside St. Michael's Cathedral, light poured through stained glass windows onto faces lifted in song, and the future stretched ahead like a promise waiting to be fulfilled.